Welcome to the Cima Revision on Performance Operations. I am Yushan Gunatilaka. Let me take you through the syllabus. Cost accounting systems, project appraisals, risk and uncertainty, budgeting and working capital are the 5 areas which comprises of the syllabus. I'll take you through the paper structure. It has section A, section B and section C. In section A we have 5 MCQs, 2 marks each. Do not show any workings for section A 1.1 to 1.5 because it doesn't carry any part marks. But 1.6, 1.7, 1.8 it carry part marks, so you need to show workings. Section B, you have 6 questions, 5 marks each, tested from mainly working capital, budgeting, risk and uncertainty. Section C, the big giant, 225 mark questions. Question 3 is mainly from activity based costing or else variance analysis. But there were 2 exceptions, if you can note down. May 2014, both activity based costing and variances were tested, and also in May 2011 both budgeting and variances were tested. Question 4 is always project appraisals. Investment appraisal techniques. Objectives of investment appraisals. Always when you invest on a project, you need to check whether your investment is recovered. Then recovering the investment is not enough, cost of capital also needs to be covered, and on top of it you need to get something out of it. And also if you have multiple projects, you need to rank projects when there are resource constraints, capital constraints. Investment appraisal techniques. Now for all investment appraisal techniques you need to know 5 things: the methodology, the role, advantages, disadvantages and the solutions for all the disadvantages you have. First technique, accounting rate of return. What is the formula? Average profit divided by investment. Now how do you calculate profit? Profit is always cash flow minus depreciation. What is depreciation? Depreciation covers the investment portion, which means if your cash flow minus depreciation is positive, that means you are covering your investment. Yeah. So if your accounting rate of return, if that is positive, that means you are covering your investment. However, that is not enough. If your ARR is 5% and your cost of capital is 10%, then do not select the project. ARR should be always greater than the cost of capital to select a project. Now let's look at the drawbacks of this technique. Now profit based techniques are always manipulatable. Why? Because some companies, they sell on credit and they get a revenue but they don't get cash. So always use cash for investment appraisals, which is a drawback of accounting rate of return. Now let me look at this example. Now in this example, project A and project B both are having the same investment. Now although having the same investment, the cash flow pattern is different and the cash flows are the same. Yeah, having the same cash flows, which project would you select, A or B? Project B would be preferred. Why? Because it has a big chunk of cash flows up front and a small chunk of cash flow at the end. But if you calculate ARR, ARR is the same for project A and project B. And also the investment recovery. In project B, your investment is recovered faster than project A. Because of that, project B should be selected. Now going back to the drawbacks, time value of money is not considered in ARR and the investment recovery is not considered in ARR. Then let's look at this example. 2 projects, X and Y. X gives a 30% ARR, Y gives only a 20% ARR. But 30% of 100 is less compared to 20% of 1000. Which means even though ARR is higher, project Y is better. Going back to another drawback, you can't compare projects using accounting rate of return. Next, investment appraisal technique, payback period. What is payback period? The time it takes to recover the investment in cash flow terms. What are the drawbacks here? A payback period being short is good, better than a payback period being long. Now, shorter payback period you tend to accept, but the thing is that take a gem mining project. You might accept a gem mining project, but after the payback period, you have a huge cash flow, huge investment to reinstate the land back. Take a mobile operator investing in 3G, investing in 4G. Right? The payback period is a large. 10 years, 11 years, 12 years. But you tend to reject the projects because the payback is short, and you will ignore what you are going to get in 10 years time, 11 years time, 12 years time. We'll look at time value of money. Now, time value of money, we'll look at timing first. Timing in the sense, all the cash flows during a year should be positioned at the end of the year. What is end of the year? End of the year is always, say, consider Y3. End of the year is Y3, meaning that is the beginning of the fourth year. Y0 is today, that is the start of the first year. Important thing to note in time value of money is working capital. Now, under working capital, what is working capital? It is a short-term cash flow during the initial phases of a project to pay for labor, pay for raw material. Now, what would you do for working capital? You have to invest working capital at the beginning and recover working capital at the end. Now, how do you incorporate time value of money? Do the calculations. There are two formats, basically the horizontal format and the vertical format. In the horizontal format, you take all one-time cash flows and discount it individually to arrive at the present value. But in a vertical format, you can tackle annuities, you can tackle perpetuities. A constant cash flow starting from Y5 to Y9, Y0 to Y4, Y4 to Y8, all can be multiplied by the annuity factor to straight away arrive at the present value. That is the objective or advantage of the vertical format. Now going back to the horizontal format, you are getting 1000 during the second year, but your present value is 756. Now what is the meaning of that? After paying the cost of capital, you are left over with 756. Now what is the meaning of cost of capital? When you are doing a project, the investors, they expect a cost for inflation, they expect a return for the opportunity costs, and they also expect a return for the risk. Now after paying all of that, you are left over with 756. Let's look at the next technique. Discounted payback, same payback concept, but the time it takes to recover the investment in present value terms. Now, what do you mean by that? After paying the cost of capital, from the balance money, how long does it take to pay your investment? But still, you have the same drawback of the entire project timeline not being considered. So if you look at this example, the discounted payback period is 5 years. But if you continue to accumulate the cash flows until the end, you are getting 279. Now, what do you mean by 279? After paying the cost of capital from the balance money, after paying the investment, you are getting 279 on top. That 279 is called the net present value of a project. Now look at this example. Project A and Project B having the same investment. NPV is 20 in Project A, NPV is 25 in Project B. Which project would you select? Obviously Project B. But let me do a slight modification. In Project B, your investment is 10,000. Now, getting 20 for 100 million investment and you are getting 25 for a 10 billion investment. Which one would you select? Most of the students make a mistake that by looking at the NPV compared to the investment. But that is wrong. Why? You are having a large pool of cash. Out of the pool of cash, you pick 100 in your first project. In your second project, you pick an entire 10 billion. But after doing the project, irrespective of whether it is 100 or 10,000, the entire investment is recovered, and on top you are getting 20, on top you are getting 25. So which project would you select if those two are mutually exclusive? If one has to be selected, Project B. Now look at the advantages. Advantages of NPV would be all the disadvantages which you had before. Time value of money is considered, cash is considered instead of profit, then the entire project life is considered, recovery of cost of capital, recovery of the investment is considered, and also you can compare the projects when the projects are mutually exclusive. But it has 4 drawbacks. It doesn't consider inflation, taxation, unequal life cycles, and you can't use NPV for capital rationing, which leads to the 4 advanced investment appraisal techniques. On top of that, a non-financial manager would always prefer a percentage. 10%, 15% they would understand. But NPV of 50,000 they wouldn't understand. So they would prefer IRR, they would prefer payback. Now, in NPV, you don't get an idea of when the investment is recovered. but payback period would talk about that. Let's move into internal rate of return. Now, what is internal rate of return? That is the average return percentage of the project. Accounting rate of return also talks about the same thing, but ARR doesn't have time value of money, IRR has time value of money. What is the rule? If the IRR is greater than the cost of capital, you would again select the project. Now let's look at this example. Two projects, project A and project B. Project A is having the higher NPV, but it has a lower IRR. What is the reason? One reason could be the size of the investment. A smaller IRR, 15% out of a larger investment is better than a larger IRR, 30% of a smaller investment. Yeah. Then the second reason is, if you carefully look at the cost of capital, if you slightly change the cost of capital, project A's NPV drops really fast, which means A is highly sensitive to cost of capital. Yeah, why does it happen? It happens because in a project, the latter cash flows are more impacted by the cost of capital than the initial cash flows. And if there's a project where you have more latter cash flows than initial cash flows, a smaller change in cost of capital will impact it by a larger margin. Then the third reason is the reinvestment assumption. NPV assumes that the money or your returns are reinvested at the cost of capital rate. But IRR assumes that it is reinvested at the IRR rate. Now, what is practical? Now, you are doing this project because this has the best IRR you will ever get. Now, can you reinvest money at a more than higher IRR? If you had that opportunity, you would do that project rather than this project. So, what is the opportunity? You can invest or reinvest your money at the cost of capital and not the IRR. So if you look at project B, NPV B is small, but if you are reinvesting your money at a higher rate than the cost of capital, chances are that you might end up getting a higher IRR. Moving on, let's look at advanced investment appraisals. Under advanced investment appraisals, I'll be talking about taxation, inflation, unequal life cycles, capital rationing, and sensitivity. Investment appraisals with taxation. Now, when you are doing a new project, you would take the cash flows, discount it, calculate the NPV, and select a project or reject a project. But on the other hand, your profit and loss account will get impacted because of the project. Either your profit goes up or else your profit comes down. And because of that, your tax either would go up or would come down. Now you need to consider that in your calculation. But how do you calculate tax? It should be always the taxable profit multiplied by the tax rate. Now what is the taxable profit? Taxable profit is taxable cash flow minus depreciation. Depreciation, you can't use your own depreciation policy because you can manipulate. So the tax authority has instructed you to use their own depreciation policy, and the depreciation calculated based on their depreciation policy is called capital allowance. Now what happens? Due to taxable cash flows, your tax would go up. Because of your capital allowance, your tax would come down, or else you would get a tax saving. Now let's say during a particular year, your taxable cash flows are low, but your capital allowances are high. That means you are getting a loss. Now when you are incurring a loss, your tax is negative. Now what would you do if a tax is negative? Don't expect the tax authorities to pay you money if the tax is negative. But if you have multiple projects and some projects are giving a profit, because of doing this project, your profit comes down and your tax comes down. That is where the tax saving comes into play. And there are certain assets where you can't deduct capital allowance. Why? Because the tax authorities does not allow you to deduct capital allowance. In that case, you have to consider zero as capital allowance. Now if you go through May 2012 question 4, in that the assets are not allowed to be depreciated or capital allowance to be claimed. Now what should you all do? Apply the tax rate on the taxable cash flows, considering capital allowance as 0. Let us take a short break, and after the break, let's discuss about investment appraisals with inflation. Welcome back. investment appraisals with inflation. Now when you are doing an investment appraisal calculation, your cash flows are not inflated. Your cash flows are not inflated, but your cost of capital is inflated. Now, when inflation is not included, we call it real. When inflation is included, we call it money, which means by default, your cash flows are real and your cost of capital is money. Now, when your real cash flows are discounted by a money cost of capital, what will happen? Your present value is understated. How would you solve this problem? You have two approaches. One is called a real approach. The other one is called a money approach. Simple solution. Real approach is to convert your money cost of capital into a real cost of capital and use it with the real cash flows. Money approach means you have to use your real cash flows, convert it to a money cash flow, include inflation and use it with the money cost of capital. Now how would you do it? How do you exclude inflation from the money cost of capital? 1 plus cost of capital divided by the 1 plus inflation rate. How would you include inflation to your cash flow? Take the cash flow, multiply it by the 1 plus inflation rate and take to the power the number of years. Now why do you need two methods? Take annuities. Now if you have a constant cash flow, what is the easier method of calculating present value? Take the annuity, multiply it by the annuity factor to arrive at the present value in total. Now you don't need to convert each cash flow to a present value. But if you are using the money approach, then inflation has to be included to your constant cash flows, then the constant cash flow will no more be a constant cash flow. So for annuities, it is better recommended to use the real approach. But why can't you use the real approach for all your calculations? Let's say your labor is inflated by 10% and your material is inflated by 4%. Can you use the real approach? No, you can't, because you have two inflation rates. What inflation rate would be excluded from the money cost of capital? You have a problem. Then there are certain instances where some cash flows are inflated, some are not. It is the same as having two inflation rates. You can't use the real approach. Plus, some years are inflated, some years are not. In some questions, why one is not inflated, there on it is inflated. Again, you can't use the real approach. And when you have tax, now when you have tax, I earlier told you all, how do you calculate tax? Taxable cash flow minus capital allowance. Now capital allowance is never inflated. Now in that case, some are inflated, some are not. Again, you can't use the real approach. Investment appraisals with unequal life cycles. Now let's look at this example. You have two projects, project A and project B, having the same investment. Project A gives us 60,000 in PV, project B gives us 40,000 in PV. What would you select based on the NPV rule? Now NPV says higher the NPV, better it is. Now in that case, project A should be selected. But project A takes 5 years, project B takes 3 years. Now what project would you select? Is it worthwhile waiting for an extra 2 years for an extra $20,000? Is the question. Now these kind of questions are given mainly for asset replacement decisions. Now say project A is a project which has a 5-year life and it repeats once in every 5 years, and project B is repeated once in every 3 years. Now which option would you select? You can handle this using either the annual equivalent method or else the least common multiple method. What is annual equivalent? Convert all your NPV, convert your NPV to a equivalent annual return or equivalent annual cost. Now NPV is 60,000. How do you convert it to, or how do you annualize it? Divide it by 5 if time value of money is not there. But if time value of money is there, then you need to divide it by not 5 but by the annuity factor. Now in this example, the annuity factor is 3.791. 60,000 over 3.791 gives 15,827. What is the meaning of that? This project A is equivalent to a project which gives 15,827 every year. Project B is equivalent to a project which gives 16,083 every year. But to use the annual equivalent method, there are certain assumptions. The when you are repeating the cycle, the cash flows of the first cycle should be repeated in the second cycle for you to use the annual equivalent method, which means you can't use this method for inflation. And also in practical life, when you are making an investment for the second time, your cost will not be the same, or else you might buy an upgraded version or a modified version. So annual equivalent approach is not very practical. You might have to go to the least common multiple method. Now what is the approach there? Project A and project B should be converted to a common time frame, as in the 5-year project has to be repeated 3 times, 3-year project has to be repeated 5 times to arrive at a 15-year common time frame. Then compare the 15-year NPV of project A and project B. Investment appraisals with capital rationing. Now look at the given 5 projects, project A, B, C, D and E. If the projects are mutually exclusive, that means if you can select only one project out of these, what would you select? No question, the highest NPV project, project A, which gives a 30 million NPV. If the projects are not mutually exclusive, which means you can select any number of projects and you don't have any capital rationing also, no limited capital, you have enough money. Now the 5 projects would require an investment of 460 million if you add it up, and your NPV would add up to 120 million, and neither of the projects would give you a negative NPV, which means if you don't have capital rationing, projects are non-mutually exclusive, do all 5 projects. But if you have capital rationing or limited capital, what would you do? You have only 230 million investment, 230 million to be invested, but the overall A to E requires 460 million. Then you need to rank between the projects, prioritize and select between the projects. How would you tackle? If you have divisible projects and indivisible projects, there are 2 options or 2 methods. Now what is a divisible project? If you have a project and it can be broken into subparts and you can do only parts of it, that is a divisible project. Take a 10-story building, and if you stop at the 4th story only, now that is a divisible project. But take a swimming pool project for instance. Can you do a swimming pool project partially? No, you can't. That is an indivisible project. Now in a divisible project, what would you do? You have to use your foundation's contribution to limiting factor concept. Contribution equivalent is NPV here, limiting factor is investment here, so you have to take the NPV over investment, which is called the profitability index, and then rank between the projects. Now the profitability index is the highest in project D, then C, then B. So you would prioritize those 2. So if you do project D and project C, your total investment would be 170 and your balance is 60. Now from the balance 60, your 3rd project is B. You can't do the entire project, but you can do only 60% of the project, which means you would get only 60% of the NPV. So how do you calculate your NPV? 23, 25 and 60% of 27 of project B, which gives you 64.2. But under indivisible projects, what would you all do? Under indivisible projects, you have to select different combinations of projects which would satisfy your limited capital need of 230 million. Now I have selected 2 combinations, the highest NPV projects A and B. Your total NPV or a combined NPV would be 57. But instead, if you do C, D and E, still it would require only 230 million, but your combined NPV is 63. So you would go for C, D, E and E instead of A and B. Let us take a short break and move on with the next topics. Welcome back. Now let's look at another very important aspect of the syllabus, sensitivity analysis, which is very frequently tested. Now let's look at this example. Now in the example, you have a 139 million NPV project, and it comprises of investment, scrap value, revenue, variable cost and fixed cost calculated using the vertical format. Now sensitivity of selling price. Now when you change the selling price of a project, what variables would be impacted? Only the revenue, nothing else. Now when the selling price is changed by 5%, your revenue also will be changed by 5%, which means sensitivity of selling price is equivalent to the sensitivity of revenue. Now look at the present value of revenue. Now present value of revenue is 4,687. Now When 4,687 is reduced, or that present value is reduced by 139, then your NPV turns negative, then your decision reverses. So sensitivity means the percentage change required to reverse the decision or change the decision. Now in this case, what is the sensitivity of selling price? 139 divided by 4687, which gives you 3%. A 3% change in selling price would change the revenue by 3% and your NPV would become negative. Now we'll look at a complex example, sensitivity of volume. Now when your volume is changed, two variables are getting impacted, revenue and the variable cost, which means your revenue minus variable cost, the contribution will get impacted, nothing else will get impacted. Now what is the present value of contribution? 1803 in the question. Now if your present value of contribution is reduced by 139, then your NPV turns negative, your decision reverses. So what is the percentage change required to reverse the decision? 139 divided by 1803, which is 8%. Now what is more sensitive, selling price or volume? Selling price is more sensitive. Why? Because a smaller 3% change would reverse the decision. Volume, an 8% change is required to reverse the decision. So if you generalize, what is sensitivity? We took 139 divided by the present value of the required variable. So sensitivity equals NPV divided by the present value of the variable. Now say you have two projects and you have selected the highest NPV project. Now in that case, decision reverses not when the NPV becomes 0, but when the NPV is less than your second option. In that case, your sensitivity should be the NPV difference divided by the present value of variable. And also one important point which you need to note is when you have tax. Most students ignore the impact of tax on a variable, because when you change the revenue, tax also changes. That also needs to be taken in when you are calculating the sensitivity. Now, why do we need to calculate sensitivity? Now let's say you are doing an NPV calculation in an organization. You have 10-20 variables to forecast, and can you focus on all 10-20 variables under bounded rationality? No, you can't. You have a limited time. So you need to pick and choose the most important variables and do your NPV calculation. And how do you pick the variables? Based on sensitivity. And after implementing the project, you can't set targets on all 20 variables. So what would you do? You would impose strict targets on the most sensitive variables to the managers or the product managers. But say if you are just submitting an NPV to the senior managers, if it is positive, they would tell you to go ahead. But later on, if the project fails, the entire burden will come on top of your head. But if you communicate or quote an NPV with a set of assumptions and a set of sensitivities, then they also will look at your final answer, give some thoughts on it, so that the entire burden will not come on top of your head. Lastly, one important syllabus area, post-completion audit. Now, why do we need to do a post-completion audit? We have seen so many organizations where the product managers, they keep on launching products, 80 products a year, 100 products a year. They are better off with it. But no one will question as to what projects generated the initially calculated NPV. Now, what will happen at the end? Your product launch rate will increase, but the failure rate also will increase on the other hand. Now let's say there's a new product, an Indian product. An Indian vendor comes down to Sri Lanka and he says, I'll give you a concert to the Shah Rukh Khan concert, a free ticket and a free return air ticket also, make my NPV positive. What will prevent you from not taking that ticket? The post-completion audit, because you are afraid of it. Then if you do a post-completion audit, you will get to know the current run rate of the project, and if it is below the required run rate, you can recalculate the required run rate and achieve your end objective. The experience you gain out of the post-completion audit can be used for your future post-completion audits, and the other employees also will follow you. Yeah, but the drawbacks would be, however much you want to do post-completion audit, let's say you get 20 NPV calculations for new product launches as a management accountant, will you prioritize a post-completion audit without doing the other 20? No, you will always prioritize the new projects than the post-completion audit. And also, if you try to go and evaluate a product manager after implementing a project, they will really hate you, because no one would want them to be evaluated, their past performance to be evaluated by somebody who has done the NPV calculation. That ends up the investment appraisal techniques. Let's move into another very important area, risk and uncertainty. This is a bonus area where you can pass the exam easily. Now look at project X and look at project Y. Now in project Y, your expected value or the average is high. Project X, your expected value is low. Even though your expected value is low, if you look at your maximum value and the minimum value, the spread is very narrow in project X, but the spread is very wider in project Y. What project would you select? That depends on your attitude to risk, whether you are a risk taker, risk averse person, or a risk neutral person. Take a real life example, selecting a life partner. Now let's say you're going for a very pretty lady in the world, and that is like a huge return, but the thing is that it has a lot of drawbacks, a lot of risks, because thousands of people will come behind that lady and she will also demand, and you will have to regret big time, and it will cause a lot of problems. So knowing that risk, some guys would go for the risk. Those are called risk takers. But the risk averse guys, they would settle for a not so good looking girl, and they would prefer less trouble, less hassle, less problems in the future. But some guys, they take really high risks for not so worthwhile returns. Say when you are crossing the road, a bulldozer comes towards you, right, and you see a 25-cent coin along the road. Will you jump in to pick that 25-cent coin? No, right, because the risk is very high, but the return is only 25 cents. Now look at these examples. Project X and project Y. Risk takers look at the bright side of a project. Bright side as in, take project Y for instance. Project Y's bright side or the maximum is really high. Project X maximum is really low. Now which project would you select? A risk taker would go for project Y. That is called a maxi-max decision, maximum of the maximums. But the risk averse guy, he would always look at the downside or the bad side of it. Now the bad side is really worse in project Y, but not so worse in project X. So what would he do? He would look at the minimums and try to maximize the minimum. Minimum is higher in project X, so the risk averse guy would go for project X. And that is called a maxi-min decision. Then the risk neutral guy, he wouldn't ever look at the spread, he wouldn't look at the range, he would always look at the expected value. So the expected value in project Y is higher than the expected value in project X, so he would select project X. Let us take a short break, and after the break discuss the drawbacks of expected value. Welcome back. Let's look at drawbacks of expected value. Now let's say you have take Osama bin Laden. The probability of him staying in Australia is 50%. Probability of him staying in US is another 50%. Expected value gives you something like Middle East. So that is a drawback. Your expected value is not one of those outcomes you have. Then the second drawback is, look at this example. The NPV is positive 200,000, the probability is 20%. But for the NPV to be negative 20,000, there's a 80% probability. So there's a 80% chance that the project will be negative. But what happens is, if you calculate the expected value, 20% into 200,000 minus 20,000 into 80% will give you a 24,000 expected value, which is a positive expected value. So based on expected value, if you have selected the project, you would do the project. But there's a 80% chance that the project would fail. And also, you can't calculate expected value if your outcome is a qualitative outcome. Say the party, blue party wins, there's a 60% probability. For the red party to win, there's a 40% probability. What is the expected value? Is it purple? No, you can't calculate. then accuracy of the probability is subjective and there is no indication of the spread. Let's look at an application of expected value two-way table. Say you are given option of manufacturing 100 units, 150 units or 200 units. Now what is your variable cost of manufacturing? 6. What is your selling price? Selling price is 10. Now you are not sure as to whether the demand would be 100, 150 or 200 until you go to the market. In this situation, you have to prepare something called a two-way table. One way you have 100, 150, 200. The other way also you have 100, 150 and 200. Now you will get 9 data points. How do you calculate? I'll look at one example. Supplying 200 units and if the demand is 150. If you supply 200 units, your cost would be 200 into 6, 1200. But your demand is 150, your revenue would be 150 into 10, 1500. Revenue 1500, cost 1200, your return would be 300. Likewise, you can fill the entire table. Then you have to calculate the expected value for the three options you have, 100, 150 and 200. The expected value is the highest in the second option, supplying 150. So a risk neutral guy would select the second option of supplying 150. But what would a risk taker select? What would a risk averse guy select? A risk taker would select the yellow highlighted ones first, or he would look at the best outcomes first, and then out of 400, 600 and 800 he would select 800. That is called a maxi-max approach. But a risk averse guy, he would select the worst outcomes, which is 400, 100 and minus 200. Now he has selected the minimums or the worst cases, and out of that what is the maximum? Maximum is 400. We call it a maxi-min decision. So a risk averse guy would go for option 1. Risk taker would go for option 3. There is another decision criteria which is called mini-max regret criteria. Now under maxi-max you have to read it from behind. Maximum of the maximums. Maxi-min, read it from the behind. Highlight the minimums, select the maximum out of it. Mini-max regret, highlight the maximum regrets and pick the minimum out of it. Yeah, for that you have to prepare a regret table. Now how do you prepare a regret table? If your demand was 150, ideally your supply should be 150. Now in that case, your cry, you wouldn't have to cry or regret because you are getting the optimum return. But if you supply 200 but your demand was 150, then you will get only 300. Earlier you were getting 600. Now when you have an optimum of 600 but you are getting only 300, your cry is worth 300. That is your regret. So using that concept, you have to prepare a cry table or a regret table. Now what should you all do? Select the maximum cries of each option. Option 1, 100 units. What is your maximum cry? 400. Option 2, what is your maximum cry? 300. Option 3, what is your maximum cry? 600. Now out of 400, 300 and 600, no one wouldn't want to cry a lot. So what is the minimum out of those three? 300. So a mini-max regret roller would select option 2. Another important point. Lastly, value of perfect information and value of imperfect information. Let's say you are doing a project and the market conditions are unknown, whether it will be good or whether the market condition will be bad. You don't know, but somebody else might know. Say a fortune teller would be able to predict whether the demand would be good or demand would be bad. Now, without his support, let's say you are having an expected value, but with his support, if your expected value goes up, then the difference in expected value is what was created by the information provider or the fortune teller. That is called the value of information. Now if the fortune teller provides perfect information, he is 100% accurate, that expected value difference is called value of perfect information. But if he has a 95% accuracy, then your expected value will not be as high as the expected value when perfect information is given, but still it will be higher than general expected value. That expected value delta or difference will be the value of imperfect information. Look at this example. There are two projects, project X and project Y. Now if the market state is good, a risk taker would go for project X because it gives 30,000 and project Y gives only 24,000. But if the market state is bad, doing project Y is better. So a risk averse guy would look at the bad side of it. Now bad side is better in project Y, he would go for project Y. Now risk neutral guy, what would he do? He would calculate the expected value of project X, expected value of project Y. The expected value of project X is 30 multiplied by 0.6 plus 5 multiplied by 0.4. Expected value is 20,000. For project Y, the expected value is 19,200. So the expected value is high in project X, he would go for project X. That is a risk neutral guy. But now let's say you have the option of going to an information provider or a fortune teller. Now fortune teller exactly tells you, he provides perfect information, he exactly tells you whether the market state would be good or bad. Now he can't change the probability. And he can't change the probability. Probability can be either good, 60% for good and 40% for bad. Now if he says good, what would you do? You don't have any choice, you will do X and your return will be 30,000. If he says bad, you will go and do a project Y and you will get 12,000 and your expected value will be 22,800. Earlier you were getting 20,000, now you are getting 22,800. The difference between those two is what he added, or the value of his information, 2,800. Don't pay more than 2,800 to obtain that information. Now if he is not accurate, or if he is less than perfect accurate, his accuracy is 95%. Now what would happen? If the market state is good, there is a 95% chance that he would say good. Then you would select project X and you would get 30,000. But there is a 5% chance that he will make a blunder and he would say bad. Then I would do project Y, I'll end up getting only 24,000. Then if the market state is bad, there is a 85% chance that he would say bad, I would select Y and I would get 12,000. But if the market state is bad, there is a 15% chance that he would tell me good, I will do project X, but I'll end up getting 5,000. What is my expected value? 22,200. Not as high as 22,800, but not as less as 2,000 also, 20,000 also. So what is the difference? 2,200, that is the value of imperfect information. So that wraps up the day today. Hope you all have enjoyed. Let's meet on the second episode.